Welcome to Starting. I'm Deb. This week's episode is called Connecting to Climate Action. We're going to try and consider the world that we want, given what we have now, and how we're going to move forward into the future. It'll help us explore our own motivations for engaging in climate action and consider the values that we hold really important. It's going to be broken into 4 sections, one on the Talanoa dialogue process, and then 3 following sections on each of the questions that's in the Talanoa dialogue process. So the first is, where are we? The second is, where do we want to go? And the third is, how do we get there? As we engage in these different pieces of exploration into learning about the Talanoa dialogue, we're going to think about how we actually revise habits, because the Talanoa dialogue process is really about how we shift what is a current norm to a new norm based on a concern that we have about our community or our region or our nation in the now. And so there's also some resources in the episode's blog on effective methods for shifting habits, which can be very helpful, and a personal example of just an everyday example of how I'm working on shifting a habit. So that is where we're going today, and thank you so much for being here. All right, so let's start with the Talanoa dialogue process. This is a process used by the United Nations to help nations of the world come together around setting climate goals. These goals you might have heard of around things like 2030 and 2050, and they were determined years ago to try and think about how do we get nations moving toward a shared vision, a shared future, a dream, okay? And so we have to understand that as we're dreaming toward that future, we have to understand where we start from and where we're going, and then nations can figure out step by step how to get there. So as we're doing that, the Talanoa dialogue suggests that we ask these 3 simple questions. Where are we? Where do we want to go? And how do we get there? Each of these questions has to be dealt with honestly and use the best available data that can be had at any one time. It's really important that nobody involved in the dialogue lies or intentionally misleads people, because that creates just a waste of everybody's time and resources. However, there's a big difference between outright lying about any of the answers to these questions and not knowing how to access the needed information. So as we explore each of these questions, we're going to talk about some resources to help figure out how we find the answers to these questions at different scales. And we're really going to work at the local. All right, let's get started. So where are we? When we think about this question at the global scale, we usually think about the International Panel for Climate Change reports. And so those reports can be read and they're available in versions for educators, for local government, business, and industry. And I've included links for all those different versions in the written version of the blog. So you can access that via the links at the bottom of the description. For this episode. But we don't live at the global scale. So we live at these individual family community scales, and we need to figure out how to draw on local knowledge that we trust first, and then connect that to other forms of scientific data that are coming in from things like the IPCC or our nation's reports from the IPCC. So when we start to think about community questions, we can actually ask these things in our community. And we're going to want to go and ask a really good, diverse group of our community questions like, what are you worried about with respect to climate change and why? How is your work or your normal activities being disrupted by climate-related events such as weather, flooding, fire, drought, or other things? Is the weather different today substantially than in the past, and how do we know that? And then what about health concerns? Is there differences in the air quality? Are there diseases that are moving because insects or animals or other things that didn't used to be here are here now? So how do we understand those movements and health concerns that we have? Heat stroke, that's another one for health concerns that many people are starting to experience. And then what about the economy? How is our economy of our region being impacted by climate change? And how do we understand that and adapt to that and transition to economies that are going to be thriving in the future? So these are all questions that we want to understand about where we're at now and what people care about. As you're asking those questions, you're going to need to think about who you're asking. So you want a real diversity of thought, local experts such as First Nations or tribal nations, water managers, firefighters, farmers, science educators. You want to ask people in your community who have a lot of different positions to try and see what kinds of knowledges are there that you can draw on for your community's well-being. You're going to want to listen to as many different folks as you can to get the really good, complete picture of the whole situation. And this helps to reduce bias when you get a wide range of ideas on the table. Bias is always present, but it's about how we reduce it by increasing the amount of participation. Don't worry too much if you don't know everything at the beginning about where you're at. That is a continually expanding thing as you learn more and more about climate change. And there may be information that you're learning that you're skeptical about or that you're unsure. That's okay. So just hold all that kind of knowledge, think about it, organize it for yourself, have conversations with people in your community to help you think through and organize it in new ways. And that really helps you start to build a bigger sort of map of all the climate knowledge in your community. It should be noted that there are folks in communities that live in really tight echo chambers. It's a problematic way that information moves around, and it happens on all political sides of the spectrum. So you really want to encourage people that are living in an echo chamber, so an area where they're only hearing a very limited number of ideas. You want to encourage them to get out of that, be in conversation with people that might be different from them, and honestly listen to different ideas, not just to debate them and crush them, but to actually listen and consider, and maybe just sit with things at times. You don't have to walk away as a winner. We actually all want to collectively win, as opposed to, crushing any particular idea that may end up being the one that really benefits our community in the long run. All right. We also want to think about how we can start onto sort of trajectories of learning. So one of the very first things that people can do in climate action is listen. And whether that's listening in your community or listening to those who've made careers in understanding and wondering and being curious about the climate and how it's changing and how we're communicating about that. Either of those or both of those are great. I've put some resources of 10 podcasts that are highly recommended from the climate change community to be able to really start to learn about different things. So, one or two of these podcasts may totally not be your thing, but maybe you can find one in there that you'll kind of follow for a bit and learn a few things from. And again, it is not important to agree with everything. It's about listening to just start to hear diversity of ideas. All right. So that's the first question of the Talanoa dialogue. All right, the second question in the Talanoa dialogue is, where do we want to go? So I think of this question as the dreaming forward question. So each of us is living in different places around the globe, and we might have different versions of what that dream looks like, but there are going to be commonalities about the values that undergird that, the way that we're starting to hope for the future, okay? So as you're dreaming, I want you to think about not just yourself, but those that you love. So think about your friends, children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, students, maybe community members, people in your church, think about the people around you, okay? It's helpful to think in a longer time horizon, so not just like next year, but think about 20 years from now. What would you like to see for your community? And as you start to think about that, it helps you get away from the sort of tying your short-term actions to things. You get away from that when you think on a longer-term horizon. And that's what we really want to do. We want to get down to what are our values that we care about as we dream forward. So let's think about that 20-year horizon. Some of the questions that you could ask yourself are, what would society be like, right? Just like, what would your 20 year from now society be like? How will people's liberty and security be ensured? Where will we be living? What kind of buildings? How are those buildings built for the changing climate conditions? Are there different people living with us? How are the heating and cooling managed, or other energy needs? What about our food? How is it being produced? Where is it being produced? How is it being stored or moved? What about water? Like, how is that being managed? How is it clean, moving, and abundant? And who's helping to manage all that? What kind of work are we doing? How are we learning? Who are we learning from, and what are we learning? How are we accessing information? And how are we determining if that information is true? What are our cultural activities or recreational activities or spiritual activities like? So all of those questions can help us start to imagine a future that we want to grow towards. All right. And as we think about these different things, we're going to really want to try to understand why these are important to us. So what are those values underneath them that are actually the reason those dreams are what we're hoping for? Okay. There's a couple resources around exploring particular sort of human rights, rights to clean environment, rights to nature, that I've linked to, and you can kind of dive into and think about. Really, the exercise in understanding what we might want to have in the future is about considering the values that you're centering. Because you can take those values, if you identify them in your dream, and then you can pull them back to now, because often our values that we have right now are not really connected to the actions that we have in the everyday. We get kind of caught up in our everyday, and we don't have consistency between the values that we really hold and what we're doing every day. But when we start to dream, we can really center those values and see them more clearly, and that helps us sort of realign our actions today with what we're hoping to grow in the future. All right, so the last question is in the Talanoa dialogue is, how do we get there? So we have some navigational markers about where we are right now and where we want to go. And so now we have to think about, how do we get from A to B? One of the things that we need to do is we need to create some intermediary points. So 20 years is a little too far for us to plan towards. So maybe we plan a halfway dream. What is the vision of the world that we want to see 10 years from now? And then maybe another half of that, 5 years. And a 5-year plan is really doable. So then we can get down to, like, this is what we'd like to see in our lives in 5 years from now, and how do we work toward that? Okay. So creating a sort of manageable time scale that we can make really actionable goals on is helpful. We also need to think about what other information we might need. So we have these goals defined at the sort of 5, 10, 20-year marks, and we might need to think like, oh, well, we only have partial information now. So who else could we involve in our community information collecting efforts to ensure that we have as much information as possible and different knowledges come into play to help us think about what strategies to use going forward. So that may mean bringing some folks in from outside your community if you need to, experts in particular areas, whatever that may be for your community. And it could be, fire management, forestry management. It could be agricultural, new sort of emerging agricultural practices. It could be water management. There's a number of things that you might want to explore. Then as we're starting to think about our own sort of local moves, we also might want to think, what is the sort of big thing in our dream that we really want to see, like that we really care about and we think is critical? And so I've given an example in the blog for this episode around food security, because food security is actually quite universal for most societies to have some form of local food security. And so there's a bunch of things that you could do if food security is the goal that you're looking at, and any particular goal you have, you can kind of follow this set of questions. So who's engaged in that activity? How do you find them? How can you have some initial conversations about what they're doing? Learn a little bit more about what are the concerns in your area. So where are you at in that specific issue? And then just start doing in community with people who are engaged in that too, because you'll learn a ton just by working in collaboration with others who are working locally. And you'll build these relationships that really help you just expand what you're learning. And then you might also want to think about how you're managing your own emotions as you learn. Because as we learn in climate change areas, sometimes it actually can get really scary, and feelings of powerlessness in the face of climate challenges are impacting many of us. So a great way to handle that is to really think about who are you finding space to share those emotions with on a regular cadence. Okay. So it may sound like a small thing, but naming and processing climate emotions really helps move toward climate action. And if you're not comfortable doing that in your own home community or family for whatever reasons, there are online resources that I've included in the blog that really do help people connect to larger communities in different places. So it's important to move people away from these negative, despair, worried, powerlessness type emotions toward more productive feelings. All feelings are just, you need to feel them, but it is really critical to start to move forward into different forms of action in relationship with community members. So as we go forward in different episodes, future episodes of Starting, we'll also start to explore really specific examples of different types of climate action strategies and how to broaden out your field of climate action. So thank you so much for being here today.